An invisible invasion was working its way up the Mississippi River. Not an army, not a fleet, something older. The ocean itself, a dense wedge of saltwater from the Gulf of Mexico, creeping along the river bottom, defying the current, advancing on one of America's most historic cities. The target was New Orleans. The weapon was chemistry, and if it reached the city's water intakes, the consequences were not a matter of taste, they were a matter of public health. A slow-motion catastrophe that would turn the taps of nearly 1 million people toxic. The city had a deadline: 90 days. That was the warning from officials on the ground. 3 months before the water that kept New Orleans alive became the water that could poison it from the inside out. Corrosive, unsafe, gone. This wasn't a hypothetical, it was a forecast, and the clock was already running. What would you do if your government told you the water from your own faucet might not be safe to use for the next 3 months straight? Let us know in the comments. It's a reality more communities are facing. Stories like this, where entire cities are pushed to the brink by forces they cannot control, are becoming the new normal. And we are committed to documenting every single one. But here is the hard truth. An enormous number of people who find these investigations essential, watch them, and then they forget to subscribe. If this story matters to you, please take 1 second and hit that button. It is the only way our small team can continue to fund this work. Let's begin. The Mississippi River is a force of geology, a continental artery that drains 41% of the contiguous United States. For millennia, its power was absolute. The sheer volume of fresh water pouring into the Gulf of Mexico created a hydraulic wall, holding the ocean at bay. That is the only reason the city of New Orleans can exist. But here is the secret the geography has been hiding. The bed of the Mississippi River, from Natchez, Mississippi, all the way to the Gulf, is actually below sea level. It is a deep, submerged canyon. Saltwater is denser than freshwater, heavier. Given the slightest opportunity, it does not mix. It sinks. It flows underneath the freshwater, an alien current running in the wrong direction, hugging the bottom of the channel, a wedge of pure ocean, moving inland. Ordinarily, the river's flow keeps that wedge pushed far out into the Gulf. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the federal agency that manages this waterway, has a simple number for security: 300,000 cubic feet per second. At that rate of flow, the river wins. The freshwater holds the line. In the summer of 2023, the Mississippi River was not winning. A severe, crippling drought had settled over the American Midwest. The vast basin that feeds the river, the fields of Iowa, the plains of Missouri, the farmlands of Illinois, was drying out. The flow of the great river slowed, then it slowed again. By late summer, it had collapsed to 150,000 cubic feet per second, half of what was needed. The hydraulic wall was gone, and the ocean did what the ocean always does. It advanced. This was not a natural disaster happening to a pristine environment. It was a natural disaster colliding with a century of human engineering. To accommodate the massive cargo ships that are the lifeblood of the American economy, we dredged the Mississippi's shipping channel deeper and deeper. From 45 feet in 1986 to a new depth of 50 feet, completed in just 2022. We had spent billions of dollars, over decades, digging a perfect superhighway for the saltwater to invade. Every foot we dredged to make way for commerce was another foot of access we granted the Gulf. It was an engraved, and the first communities to receive that invitation were in Plaquemines Parish. Plaquemines Parish is a long, narrow strip of land that stretches down into the Gulf of Mexico like a finger pointing out to sea. It is the front line, the first place to feel the river's moods and the ocean's intentions. In June of 2023, the parish's water treatment plants started sending alarms. The enemy had arrived. Chloride levels in the raw river water began to spike. The Environmental Protection Agency has a secondary standard for drinking water. Not a health standard, but a welfare standard. The level at which water starts to taste salty, stain fixtures, and corrode pipes. That number is 250 parts per million. The water intakes for communities like Boothville and Port Sulphur were soon reading levels far above that threshold. The taste was undeniable. But the taste was the least of their problems. High chloride water is aggressive. It acts like a solvent on metal. It strips away protective coatings inside water mains and household plumbing, releasing whatever is in the pipes directly into the water supply. It is an infrastructure attack at the molecular level. For over 200 days, the residents of Lower Plaquemines Parish, lived in a state of water insecurity. 209 days, to be exact. It was a marathon disaster. The parish distributed more than 1.5 million gallons of bottled water. They were not just fighting for drinking water. They were fighting for water to cook, to bathe, to live. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had to deploy military-style reverse osmosis water purification units, mounting them on 18-wheeler trailers parked at the parish's beleaguered treatment facilities, just to produce usable water. W. Keith Hinckley, the Plaquemines Parish president, described the situation years later. His words were simple. "If you'd have been around us last year, it was brutal. It was bad. Our residents were suffering because of it." Think about that for a moment. Your local government handing out bottled water for 209 days, 7 months. What does that do to a community's trust in its own infrastructure? What does it do to the basic assumption that when you turn on the tap, what comes out will be safe? Drop your thoughts on that below. The suffering in Plaquemines was a warning. The saltwater wedge was not a stationary problem. It was moving. It was crawling up the riverbed at a rate of 1 to 2 miles per day. A slow, silent invasion, headed directly for the 500,000 people in the city of New Orleans. New Orleans was watching the numbers from Plaquemines with a growing sense of dread. The city's complex, aging water system was not built for this. On September 22, 2023, as the wedge crept closer, Mayor Latoya Cantrell signed an emergency declaration for the city. It was a signal. The threat was no longer distant. It was imminent. 5 days later, on September 27th, Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards successfully lobbied for a federal emergency declaration from President Joseph R. Biden, unlocking FEMA support. The city was officially on a war footing against an invisible enemy. Then came the number that focused every mind in the city. Colin Arnold, the New Orleans Homeland Security Chief, delivered a stark briefing to city officials. Based on the wedge's current speed and the dire river flow forecasts, the city could be dealing with saltwater in its primary water intakes for up to 90 days. A 3-month crisis. The announcement triggered a quiet panic across the metro area. Stores saw runs on bottled water. Residents who remembered the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina began to stockpile supplies. The city was facing a disaster with no storm, no visible destruction, just a silent chemical countdown. And here is the part the national news reports largely missed. The real fear inside the Sewerage and Water Board of New Orleans, the city's utility, was not the salty taste. That was an inconvenience. The real fear was a public health catastrophe on the scale of Flint, Michigan. Ghassan Corban, the executive director of the SWIBNO, had to confront a terrifying legacy. The city of New Orleans still has an estimated 50,000 active lead service lines connecting homes to the water mains. For decades, the utility had carefully managed the water chemistry to create a protective mineral coating on the inside of these old pipes, a process called passivation. This thin layer effectively seals the lead, preventing it from leaching into the drinking water. The salt water was a wrecking ball aimed at that delicate balance. The high concentration of chloride ions in the Gulf water is violently corrosive. It would strip those protective coatings away in a matter of days. Once that shield was gone, the raw, aggressive water would be in direct contact with thousands of lead pipes, dissolving heavy metals into the water flowing to family homes, schools, and hospitals. It was not a possibility. It was a certainty, a citywide lead poisoning event, triggered by a drought hundreds of miles away. This is the silent threat most people never heard about. It explains the urgency, the emergency declarations, the sense of impending doom. If you know anyone who thinks this was just about inconvenient, salty-tasting water, share this documentary with them. And if this deep dive is providing you genuine value, take a moment to hit the like button. It is a critical signal that tells our team to make more investigations just like this one. The only agency with the power and equipment to fight a war on this scale was the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The New Orleans District, commanded by Colonel Cullen Jones, was now responsible for defending the entire region. The current National Weather Service Mississippi River forecast the river's volume to fall to historic lows, he announced in a press release. If these conditions occur, the USACH-constructed saltwater barrier sill is expected to be overtopped. He was managing expectations. He was telling the public that their first line of defense might not hold. The plan itself was audacious. It was brute force engineering. If the river could not push the saltwater out, the Corps would build a wall to keep it out. an underwater dam, constructed on the bed of the river itself. They chose a location at River Mile 64, near a small community called Myrtle Grove. It was a strategic choke point, upstream of the most vulnerable water intakes, but far enough downriver to offer some protection to Plaquemines. The contract was awarded to a company called Weeks Marine. Their weapon of choice was a massive cutterhead dredge named the J.S. Chatry. The work was relentless. The dredge worked around the clock, clawing sediment from one part of the riverbed and piling it up to form a massive underwater ridge. The initial target was to build this barrier, this sill, up to an elevation of -55 feet below sea level. A colossal undertaking, happening in total darkness, in a river with zero visibility, while contending with the powerful currents of the Mississippi and the constant passage of deep draft cargo ships that could not be stopped. The global economy had to keep moving, even as the region's survival hung in the balance. The sill was completed, a monumental feat of engineering, finished in days, and it was not enough. The saltwater wedge, driven by the relentless physics of density and the pathetic flow of the river, did exactly what Colonel Jones had warned it might do. It washed over the top of the Bryant's 55-foot sill and kept moving north. The first line of defense had been breached. The timeline was shrinking. The wedge was still coming for New Orleans. So the Corps went back to work. There was no other option. They had to make the wall taller. Crews returned to River Mile 64 and began augmenting the sill, dredging and piling more and more sediment onto the underwater structure. They raised it another 25 feet, bringing the crest of the sill to an elevation of -30 feet below sea level. It was a desperate move. They had to leave a 620-foot wide notch in the sill to allow the massive, deep-hulled ships to pass through, but for the rest of its width, it was now a formidable underwater mountain. And here is where the engineering becomes elegant. The sill was not just a wall, it was a ramp. This was the insight of experts like Dr. Stephen Murphy from Tulane's School of Public Health. He explained that as the dense, heavy salt water creeping along the bottom of the river hits the steep face of the sill, it has nowhere to go but up. It is launched upward, forced from the slow-moving bottom layers into the much faster freshwater currents, racing along the river's surface. Those upper currents then grab the displaced salt water and sweep it back downriver, toward the Gulf. It was a brilliant piece of hydraulic jujitsu, using the river's own remaining strength against its enemy. They were not just blocking the wedge, they were using a ramp to throw it back into the current that was supposed to have defeated it in the first place. I know we mentioned this before, but if you have made it this far into the story, you are clearly invested in understanding these complex issues. We, a small, independent team, and every single subscription we get is critical for us to fund future documentaries like this one. It takes you just 1 second, but for us, it makes all the difference in the world. Thank you for that. Okay, I will try to stop bugging you about it. For now, the augmented sill was a masterpiece of crisis engineering, but it was not a silver bullet. Colonel Jones and his team knew it was only buying them time. Dr. Murphy was clear in his analysis. The low flow remains the problem, he stated, and the wedge will top the sill without more flow. The ramp could only do so much. The fundamental problem, the lack of freshwater pressure from upriver, had not changed. The sill slowed the invasion. It did not end it. So the Corps launched a second, simultaneous operation, a logistical ballet of staggering scale. If they could not stop all the salt water from getting to the municipal water intakes, they would dilute it on site. They began a massive barging operation. They dispatched a fleet of barges to pull fresh water from points on the Mississippi, hundreds of miles upstream, above the saltwater intrusion. They then hauled that water downriver, creating a floating pipeline of fresh water delivered directly to the doorstep of the struggling treatment plants in Plaquemines Parish. The first barge, carrying 500,000 gallons of fresh water, arrived at the Port Sulphur Water Treatment Facility on October 1st, 2023. It was the beginning of an aquatic lifeline that would ultimately deliver 153 million gallons of clean water for blending. Think of the logistics, coordinating the filling, the transit, and the offloading of countless barges, day after day, week after week, all while the primary battle at the underwater sill was still being waged. It was a two-front war. Even with the sill and the barges, the outcome was still uncertain. USAT's models still showed the wedge advancing, albeit much more slowly. The leading edge was projected to reach the Algiers water treatment plant, which serves the west bank of New Orleans, by late October. The main Carrollton water plant, which serves the vast majority of the city, was next in line. The situation was so precarious that the neighboring parishes of Jefferson and Orleans began preparing for a doomsday scenario. They started drawing up emergency plans to rapidly construct temporary pipelines, some as long as 15 miles. These pipelines would be a desperate, last-ditch effort to pull fresh water from sections of the river much farther upstream, bypassing their own contaminated intakes entirely. The projected cost was astronomical, somewhere between $100 and $250 million, for a piece of infrastructure that would be built in a panic and hopefully used for only a few months. That is how close they came. They were preparing to spend $250 million on an emergency pipeline because nobody could say for certain if the underwater wall and the fleet of water barges would be enough. The city was holding its breath. Then, on October 12, 2023, the tide began to turn. Not in the river, but in the data. The Army Corps of Engineers released an updated forecast. For the first time in months, the news was good. The combination of the augmented sill and a slight, almost imperceptible increase in river flow from early autumn rains in the Midwest had finally done it. The advance of the saltwater wedge had stalled. Then, it began a slow retreat. The models now showed the leading edge of the saltwater staying downriver, miles away from the critical New Orleans intakes. For the first time, Ghassan Corban and the team at the Sewerage and Water Board could exhale. The threat of mass lead poisoning had been averted. The 90-day doomsday clock had been stopped. Over the next few months, as more significant rainfall finally returned to the parched Mississippi Basin, the river's flow rate began to climb. It ticked past 200,000 cubic feet per second, then 250,000. It approached the magic number of 300,000. With every passing day, the river's natural power returned, pushing the saltwater wedge farther and farther back toward the Gulf. On January 25, 2024, the USACE released its final weekly forecast. The crisis was officially over. The wedge had been pushed back to River Mile 11, deep in the Birdfoot Delta, harmlessly out of reach. The total duration of the saltwater intrusion event, from the first impacts in Plaquemines Parish to the final declaration, was 209 days. A slow-motion disaster that had brought an entire region to its knees. The engineers had won. The city was safe. The taps were clean. And still, the problem has not been solved. It has only been deferred. The 2023 saltwater intrusion was not a freak event. It was an escalation. Historically, the Army Corps had only needed to build these emergency underwater sills on rare occasions, roughly once a decade. They built one in 1988, then 1999, then 2012. These were seen as anomalies, the result of exceptionally bad drought years. Then they had to build one in 2022, and then again in 2023, the event documented in this crisis. The first time sills were required in back-to-back years. It was an alarming acceleration. Then, in the low water season of 2024, it happened again. For a third consecutive year, the river flow dropped to dangerous levels, and the Corps was forced to construct yet another sill to protect the drinking water of Southeast Louisiana. What used to be a once-in-a-generation emergency has become a yearly maintenance task, a terrifying new normal. The cost of this new reality is staggering. The emergency sills and barging operations are temporary fixes, costing tens of millions of dollars each time. W. Keith Hinckley has stated that a permanent solution for Plaquemines Parish alone, like moving water intakes farther upstream or building desalination plants, could cost his parish upwards of $200 million. Money they do not have. The very foundation of life in this region is being renegotiated by the climate. The delicate balance between the river and the sea, a balance that allowed a major city to flourish at the edge of a continent, is broken. The engineering that saved New Orleans in 2023 was a brilliant, desperate, and ultimately temporary solution to a permanent problem. The question is no longer if another crisis will come. It is only when, and whether the next one will be even worse. Did the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers save New Orleans? Or did they just deploy the world's most expensive water cannons and underwater earthworks against an ocean that will always, eventually, win? The sill at River Mile 64 is not permanent. The river's own current will eventually wash it away, returning the channel to its dredged depth, ready for the next invasion. The solution was designed to be temporary. The problem is not. The cycle of drought and low flow is accelerating. The human engineering that deepened the river for commerce remains a permanent vulnerability. The 50,000 lead pipes are still under the streets of New Orleans. Every element of the 2023 crisis is waiting for a repeat performance. The victory was real. The relief was palpable. But it was a victory in a single battle, not the war. Somewhere in the dark, deep channel of the Mississippi River,